I am Elias. In the stone silence of a remote monastery in the south of Italy, where the wind climbed the hills carrying the scent of earth and olive trees, there grew a place that became less a building than an axis between worlds. It was San Giovanni Rotondo, small and austere at first, perched like a humble watchtower between heaven and earth. The courtyard echoed with the simple sounds of monastic life, sandals on stone, the creak of wooden doors, the murmur of Latin prayers before dawn. Yet beneath this outward simplicity, a furnace of spiritual intensity burned. At the center of this fire stood a friar with tired eyes and wounded hands, who for decades took a seat in a small wooden confessional and watched souls laid bare in a light that was not his own. What unfolded there was a mystery that defied the categories of ordinary psychology and yet plunged into its depths with ruthless precision. It was the strange and terrible gift of Padre Pio to see inside human souls during confession. The spiritual environment around him was formed long before the crowds arrived. In the early years, the monastery corridors were quiet and cool. The walls smelled of lime and old wood, the air heavy with incense from the small church where the friars gathered for the divine office. Candle flames flickered before images of Christ and the Virgin, casting wavering halos of light on stone. The rhythm of prayer marked every hour, rising and falling like the breathing of a sleeping giant. In cell and cloister, the friars carried on their hidden battles, wrestling with distractions, fatigue, and their own hearts. Into this cloistered world came a young Capuchin who had already known strange interior phenomena before his arrival. From childhood, Padre Pio had sensed an invisible companionship. He spoke of seeing Jesus, Mary, his guardian angel, and the dark forms of demons that clawed at his peace. At first, these experiences unfolded in obscurity, far from public notice, like subterranean rivers shaping the soil from below. When he was still a young friar, his body began to carry marks that matched his interior life. Mysterious illnesses struck him down, leaving him weak and burning with fever. He experienced attacks that doctors struggled to classify, episodes of suffocation and pain that seemed to have no clear physical cause. At the same time, his prayer deepened into a form of contemplation in which the presence of God felt painfully near, a burning that both consumed and sustained him. He began to receive extraordinary graces that the tradition calls charisms, gifts given not for personal glory, but for the benefit of others. Among these was a supernatural sensitivity to the interior world of those around him. To understand what this meant when he took his place in the confessional, one must first picture that confessional as it was. It was not gilded or grand, but simple wood, darkened by use and age. The booth was narrow, barely large enough to hold a man comfortably. In summer, it grew stifling. In winter, it became a small cave of cold. The grill through which he heard confessions allowed only a filtered glimpse of the person kneeling, a shadowed profile, the outline of a hand. Outside, benches creaked under the weight of those waiting. Rosaries clicked softly as beads slipped through fingers. The smell of sweat and wool coats mingled with wax and incense. Some came with eyes fixed on the floor. Some stared blankly ahead, lost in their own fears. Some, unable to sit, paced slowly, each step a question about whether to stay or flee. The whole space around the confessional seemed to hold its breath. By the time Padre Pio entered, he was already exhausted. His day usually began in the deep dark of early morning, when only the faintest light brushed the horizon and stars still clung to the sky. He would rise from a narrow bed, his body protesting with every movement, and make his way to the chapel to celebrate Mass. For him, the Mass was no routine service, but a living participation in the sacrifice of Christ. So intense that he often appeared transported, marked by physical and spiritual suffering. By the time he finished at the altar, he had already poured out more strength than most spend in a day. Yet hours of confession lay ahead. He walked to the confessional slowly, as if climbing an invisible hill. His breathing labored, his hands aching. Sweat sometimes ran down his forehead, even in cold weather. Not from heat alone, but from an inner strain no onlooker could fully measure. His emotional strain matched his physical fatigue. Each day he knew that he would be confronted with the full spectrum of human weakness and cruelty, with betrayals, addictions, violence, infidelities, blasphemies, despair. He knew that he would sit while people poured out their sins, some lightly as if describing a trivial matter, others with sobs that shook their bodies. He knew he would encounter both docility and fierce resistance. The knowledge did not harden him. Instead, it deepened a sorrowful tenderness, a willingness to stand once more on the shore where the wreckage of so many lives washed up. Before entering the confessional, he often prayed with intensity, asking not to be overwhelmed, asking that he might love each soul with the love of Christ, and not with his own capacity, which would have broken long before. Beneath all this, his earlier mystical sensitivity had prepared him for a mode of perception that is difficult to describe in human language. As a young man, he had already experienced vivid spiritual visions. He spoke of battles with demons that left him bruised and bleeding, of consolations that flooded him with light, of an inner voice that corrected him and guided him. Over time, his spiritual directors came to recognize that, despite the risk of deception that always hovers around such phenomena, there was an authentic grace at work. With this came a sharpening of his inner senses. Just as some people are born with exceptional hearing or sight, so he seemed to possess an extraordinary spiritual discernment that grew with prayer and suffering. When a penitent knelt and began to speak, he did not simply evaluate their words with human intelligence. It was as if a veil thinned for him, and the soul itself became faintly visible. He did not see a ghostly double or a floating image, but he experienced a direct, intuitive knowledge of the person's interior state. Sins long forgotten, patterns of vice concealed even from the penitent's own awareness, motives hidden beneath respectable surface behavior, all rose before him with uncanny clarity. He saw the wounds inflicted by others, the scars of childhood rejections, the bitterness formed by years of injustice. He saw temptations that had not yet blossomed into acts but were already coiled like snakes in the heart, ready to strike if allowed to grow. He perceived not only what had been done but what had been desired, imagined, consented to in silence. In some cases, the soul appeared to him bathed in light, wounded and dirty perhaps, but fundamentally turned toward God. The sins confessed in such cases might be numerous, but the basic orientation of the heart was clear. These souls usually approached with humility, sorrow, and trust. Their contrition radiated in a way that he could almost feel physically, like warmth in a cold room. The darkness around them shrank back as they spoke, as if the truth itself contained a cleansing fire. In such moments, his role was to steady them, to reassure them of forgiveness, to guide them gently into a deeper surrender. Other souls frightened him by the depth of their darkness. Here, fear had become hardness, and guilt had curdled into cynicism or despair. These penitents might present themselves with a mask of indifference. They might sit as if bored, list a few minor faults, laugh away the suggestion of deeper sin. Yet as they spoke, he saw behind their eyes a spiritual wasteland, parched and cracked, where nothing alive seemed to grow. Sometimes he sensed a deliberate pact with evil, a long-term cooperation with habits of cruelty, exploitation, or sacrilege. In such cases, the demons that circled them were not simply attacking from outside, but had found footholds inside. Rooms of the heart where they had been invited and now refused to leave. He detected lies in an instant. A penitent might omit a sin, gloss over an event, downplay their responsibility, or shift blame. In ordinary circumstances, a confessor relies on what is said. Padre Pio was not limited in this way. When a soul lied, even in subtle ways, he felt a sharp dissonance, a jarring contradiction between the word and the reality he perceived. It was like hearing someone play a wrong note in a melody he knew perfectly. This dissonance provoked in him a holy intolerance. He could not allow the sacrament to be used as a stage for self-deception, so he would interrupt. Without drama, without elaborate explanation, he would name the sin that had been hidden, sometimes in startling detail. The effect was devastating and liberating at once. One might suppose that such exposure would be purely humiliating. Yet his purpose was never to shame for its own sake. His goal was to pierce the armor of pride and fear that prevented the soul from receiving mercy. A person who believed they could control what God saw, who believed that confession was a negotiation they could manage by selectively admitting guilt, needed to be confronted with a truth that shattered that illusion. When he revealed their hidden acts or thoughts, the penitent discovered that they were fully known, entirely seen, with all their ugliness, and still invited to repent. The psychological impact of this realization could not easily be measured. It was both terrifying and strangely consoling. He recognized self-deception in more subtle forms. Not everyone lied with conscious intent. Many carried stories about themselves that were partially true, yet distorted. A man who had been gravely wronged might build his entire identity around that wound, absolving himself of responsibility for the harm he now inflicted on others. A woman raised in severe religious fear might interpret every minor fault as damnation, refusing to see the genuine goodness in her life. Others hid behind roles, using their social status, religious involvement, or good works to avoid confronting deeper selfishness. Padre Pio saw through these structures of false identity. He understood that the most dangerous lies are those we tell ourselves because they feel like truth. His corrections could therefore be ferocious. He might refuse absolution temporarily, insisting that the person face what they were avoiding. Psychologically, this was a kind of shock therapy of the soul, breaking up the crust of denial so that the living core could breathe. The confessional was surrounded by an invisible theater of combat. The presence of angels and demons was not an abstract doctrine for him, but a daily empirical fact of a different order. On some days, the air felt light and clear. People came disposed, grace flowed readily, and the atmosphere of prayer around the church was strong. Other days, a heaviness pressed down from the moment he entered the confessional. He felt distraction gnawing at him, irritation rising without clear cause, the line outside growing more restless and noisy. Penitents who had resolved firmly to confess found themselves assailed by sudden doubts, irrational fears, or excuses that seemed compelling. He recognized in these patterns the work of destructive spirits who hated confession with a particular hatred. Through his inner sight, he sometimes perceived guardian angels standing beside their charges, leaning toward him as if to help communicate what the person could not say. Their presence was a counterweight to the pressure of darkness. In extremely difficult cases, he would invoke them silently, asking their help. Demons, by contrast, manifested themselves as shadows of confusion and resistance. He sensed them trying to block memory, to twist words, to reawaken shame at the critical moment. He understood that many addictions were not merely psychological habits, but also spiritual bonds reinforced by these influences. When dealing with such souls, his words were carefully chosen, not only to challenge the mind, but to break these bonds in the name of Christ. The emotional and psychological tension felt by penitents in his confessional was extraordinary. Many arrived, already shaken by stories of his gifts. They had heard that he could read hearts, that he might refuse absolution, that he might send them away if they came without seriousness. For some, this expectation generated anxiety, sweaty palms, racing heart, dry mouth. They rehearsed their confession in their minds, wondering how much to say, whether to reveal the worst. Others came skeptical, convinced that it was all exaggeration and superstition. They approached expecting a normal confession with a tired old friar, nothing more. When they knelt, the reality often shattered their expectations. He might greet them with a word that revealed he already knew why they had come. He might name their place of origin without being told, refer to an event from their childhood, or quote to them the very words they had used in sin or in prayer alone. These details were not collected through spies or gossip. They emerged from his mysterious participation in divine knowledge of souls. The psychological impact of such revelations could not be overstated. A hardened criminal hearing his secret crimes named in a confessional miles away from the scene. A lukewarm believer hearing his hidden compromises laid out. A person trapped in an affair hearing the name and circumstances revealed without ever having mentioned them, suddenly realized that he was dealing with an instrument of God who saw beyond masks. In that intense moment, many reactions flared. Some broke immediately, bursting into tears, their carefully composed facade melted by the blazing light of truth. Others bristled, anger rising as a last defense. Pride hates being exposed. A few stormed out, refusing to surrender. Yet even those who left often found that the memory of the encounter burned in them, haunting them, drawing them back later with deeper humility. For those who opened their hearts, his corrections, rebukes, compassion, and silence were shaped precisely by what he saw in the soul. He did not treat everyone the same way. To a fragile person prone to scruples, who already exaggerated their own faults, he could be disarmingly gentle. He would cut through their obsessive self-accusation, directing them to trust in mercy and to stop dissecting every interior movement. To a proud or cynical soul, he could be abrupt, even scathing. He might raise his voice, chastise their hypocrisy, or point out the hypocrisy of confessing sins without any intention of changing. To one addicted to impurity, he might lay down firm and specific conditions, end the relationship, leave the environment, change the circle of friends. He knew that vague resolutions are too weak to stand against ingrained habits. To someone in despair, he might fall silent for a long time, letting the presence of Christ speak more loudly than any human word. His silence was itself a language. At times, when a person poured out their heart, he said almost nothing, offering only brief phrases of guidance and then absolution. The penitent might leave feeling underwhelmed, wanting more dramatic affirmation. But he knew that too many words sometimes distract from the main act of grace. At other times, he allowed silence to stretch uncomfortably, confronting the penitent with their own reluctance to go deeper. The way he used rebuke or tenderness was never arbitrary. It flowed from his reading of what the soul needed in that moment, what would awaken true contrition, what would prevent despair, what would increase trust. The spiritual weight he carried from day to day was immense. Hearing confessions for 10, 12, or even more hours in a single day was not only physically draining, it meant absorbing streams of pain, guilt, trauma, and darkness. Each story left an imprint. He did not simply listen and forget. The sins confessed, the tears shed, the resistances encountered, all passed through his heart. In prayer, he offered them to God, but their traces remained. At night, when he finally returned to his cell, sleep did not always come easily. Memories of confessions swirled in his mind. He prayed for the souls whose voices still echoed inside him, asking for perseverance for those who had begun to change, for breakthrough for those still enslaved. His own body bore signs of this burden. He suffered from headaches, stomach pains, and bouts of weakness. His stigmata, the mysterious wounds on his hands, feet, and side, throbbed constantly. The pain intensified during days of heavy confessional ministry, as if the sins he heard pressed directly upon those living reminders of the crucifixion. He accepted this as part of his mission. In some testimonies, he spoke of offering his suffering for sinners. This was not pious rhetoric for him. It was a concrete, daily reality. As he heard accusations of sin, he silently pleaded to God, asking that his pain might in some way be used to lighten their punishment, to soften their hearts, to gain them the grace to avoid falling again. The transformations he witnessed in souls were his consolation. He saw people arrive bowed down by years of guilt, who had not confessed in decades, and watched them walk away with a lightness in their step and a new clarity in their eyes. He saw marriages on the brink of collapse, poisoned by betrayal or coldness, begin to mend after both spouses underwent deep confessions and received firm yet hopeful guidance. He saw men enslaved to drink or lust make firm breaks with their patterns, not always perfect, but real, accompanied by visible changes in behavior. He saw atheists and skeptics drop their masks when confronted by his knowledge of their lives, and he heard their halting words as they acknowledged, perhaps for the first time in years, that God might be real and close. One story repeated in variations through his ministry was that of those who came out of curiosity or even mockery and left changed. A person might travel to San Giovanni Rotondo to see the famous friar, to test him, to catch him in a fraud. They would enter the confessional with arms folded internally, determined not to be impressed. Then, as he spoke, as he exposed their inner life, their past sins, their present emptiness, the armor fell. Tears flowed where there had been scorn. In these conversions, the psychological and spiritual threads interwove tightly. They did not simply assent to propositions. They encountered a gaze that knew them completely and did not turn away. That experience cut through defenses that no argument could pierce. Thousands of such stories accumulated over the years, like drops filling a basin. Pilgrims returned home and told others what they had experienced. Word spread across Italy. Then, beyond, photos began to circulate, crude at first, then more polished, showing a bearded friar in brown habit, eyes downcast or lifted in prayer, hands bandaged. Articles were written. Some cast him as a living saint, others as a fraud or an overexcited mystic promoted by credulous peasants. Church authorities sometimes moved cautiously, concerned about the cult of personality forming around him. They imposed restrictions for a time, limiting his ministry, observing him closely. Through it all, the line at the confessional never ceased. People traveled from distant countries, crossing oceans and continents, to kneel in that narrow box. Some did so after decades of living far from faith, drawn by stories of a man who could tell them the truth about themselves. Others came desperate, having tried therapies, philosophies, other religions, yet still feeling trapped in patterns of sin and sorrow. The journey itself was an act of hope. To make it, they had to admit that they needed help, that their own efforts had not been enough. When they arrived and waited for hours or days to confess, the anticipation built. Whatever happened inside, they knew they were stepping into a place where many before them had found a turning point. The historical impact of his gift extended beyond individual conversions. In an age when many began to view confession as an outdated practice, mechanical and psychologically damaging, Padre Pio embodied another dimension of the sacrament. Through him, People saw confession not as a ritual obligation, but as an encounter with a God who is intimately involved with the concrete details of their lives. His reading of souls suggested that no thought, no act, no tear was unnoticed. This countered the modern sense of anonymity, of being lost in a mass of billions, unseen and interchangeable. In a world increasingly marked by impersonal institutions and lonely individuals, his confessional became a place of radical personalism. The broader significance of his spiritual mission lies in how it revealed the depth and complexity of the human soul. Through the stories of those who confessed to him, one glimpses the many layers of human interiority. There are wounds from family history that influence choices decades later. There are fears that drive people towards sin, even when they intellectually know better. There are self-deceptions that require extraordinary confrontation to be broken. There are hidden virtues, acts of kindness unknown even to the one who performed them, remembered by God and sometimes revealed by his instrument to encourage the despondent. The soul is not a simple ledger of good and bad deeds. It is a living, wounded, beautiful, and dangerous reality. Padre Pio's ministry in the confessional also shows that genuine spiritual discernment goes beyond mere psychological insight, though it includes it. He was not a therapist in sandals delivering general advice based on observation. He was a mystic participating in the knowledge and compassion of Christ, yet still using and respecting the natural patterns by which the human heart operates. He understood that shame can paralyze or liberate, depending on how it is met. He knew that guilt can be healthy when it leads to repentance, and deadly when it becomes a permanent self-condemnation that denies the possibility of forgiveness. He saw how pride hides in religious clothing as easily as in open sin, masquerading as virtue. And he cut through those masks with precision. His own moral and spiritual burden from witnessing the interior world of humanity was enormous. Over the decades, he looked upon thousands of souls, each with its unique combination of beauty and horror. He saw the capacity for sanctity in ordinary people, the potential for heroic love in those who believed they could do nothing great. He also saw the abysses into which human freedom can fall, the cruelty people inflict on those closest to them, the contempt for God that can grow in hearts once tender. Carrying knowledge of such extremes could have crushed him into cynicism or despair. Instead, he leaned ever more heavily on Christ, uniting his horror at sin and his compassion for sinners to the pierced heart he contemplated daily at the altar. In his final years, his body bent further under suffering. The lines on his face deepened. His eyes often looked far away, as if seeing two worlds at once. Yet, the confessional remained, as long as he had strength to sit in it. Even when he could hear fewer confessions than before, the memory of his decades of ministry continued to draw souls to San Giovanni Rotondo. After his death, testimonies continued to spread, some written by those who had gone to him, others passed down orally. These stories form a kind of secondary sacrament, signs that point to the mercy of God, acting in one specific time and place through one fragile human instrument, to watch with the imagination. A day unfold in his confessional is to feel both the suffocating intensity of guilt and the exhilarating relief of grace. It is to hear whispered confessions tumbling over each other, lips stumbling over words never spoken aloud before. It is to see trembling hands clutch the edge of the wooden partition, knuckles white. It is to feel sweat on brows not from heat alone but from fear of being rejected. It is to sense the pounding of hearts as long-hidden sins finally cross the threshold of speech. It is to feel the almost physical silence that follows absolution, a silence thick with presence, broken only by the low murmur of a penance assigned. It is also to feel the invisible drama around each confession. A soul walks toward the confessional, and darkness whispers 100 reasons to turn back. Not today. You are too tired. You have confessed this before. It does not matter. You are beyond help, or you are not so bad. You do not need this. Meanwhile, grace calls quietly. Come now. Do not delay. A guardian angel stands close, aching for the soul to choose truth. Inside, Padre Pio sits, weary, prayerful, ready to enter yet another interior world. The outcome is not predetermined. Human freedom remains, fragile and powerful. When the soul chooses to kneel and speak fully, to let itself be seen and forgiven, something happens that no psychologist or historian can fully measure. A story changes direction. A future opens that was closed. A chain breaks. Seen from the outside, his confessional was just a wooden box in an Italian church. Seen with the eyes of faith and through the testimonies of those whose lives were changed there, it was a forge where hearts were reshaped in the fire of mercy. Padre Pio's extraordinary mystical gift to see inside souls did not exist for spectacle. It existed to strip away illusion, to awaken conscience, to offer hope, and to reveal, with unsparing clarity, both the poverty and the greatness of the human heart. In a time and a world that often prefers the surface, his life was a relentless reminder that what truly defines us lies beneath, where God alone sees fully, and where, through graces like his, that sight sometimes breaks into the world to call us home.